The morning my daughter-in-law served me with a guardianship petition, my son was parked across the street in a rental car, engine running, watching through the windshield like he was waiting for something to happen. I noticed him before I noticed the process server. That's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal. You often see the audience before you see the knife. The man at my door was young, maybe 30, holding a manila envelope with both hands like it might bite him. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you. Are you Lawrence Holt?" I told him I was. He handed me the envelope and walked away without making eye contact. I lived across the street. My son gave me a small wave. Not a friendly wave. The kind you give someone when you want them to know you're watching. I opened the envelope right there on the porch. The petition claimed I was no longer capable of managing my own financial affairs. It cited, and I'm quoting directly here, documented episodes of confusion and memory impairment. It requested that the court appoint my son, Derek, as my legal financial guardian, giving him full control over my assets, my accounts, my home, and my retirement funds. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I have reviewed, by conservative estimate, 4,000 fraud cases in my career. I once testified before a Senate subcommittee about patterns in international money laundering. I read the petition twice, folded it carefully, and went inside to make coffee. Some things require a clear head. My name is Lawrence Holt. I live alone in a 4-bedroom colonial in Naperville, Illinois, a house I bought in 1989 when this suburb was still mostly farmland at the edges. My wife Carol passed 6 years ago from pancreatic cancer, and the house has been mine alone since then. Derek is my only child. He's 41. He sells commercial real estate in Chicago, or at least he tells people that's what he does. I should explain what I mean by that. Derek was never dishonest as a child. That's the part that confuses me most, looking back. He was a good student, reasonably kind, played soccer in high school, went to University of Illinois on a partial academic scholarship. Carol and I were proud. We paid the rest of his tuition without complaint because that's what you do for your kid when you can afford it. The problem started quietly, the way most problems do. 3 years after college, Derek married a woman named Cassandra, who went by Cass. She was beautiful in a way that made you slightly uncomfortable. The kind of beauty that arrives in a room like an announcement. She had opinions about everything and delivered them with complete confidence regardless of whether she had any basis for them. The first time I met her, she told me that Naperville was a dying suburb and that anyone still living there was just too afraid to move somewhere interesting. Carol had laughed politely. I had smiled and said nothing. 31 years with the FBI teaches you that the people who talk the loudest are usually covering something quiet. Cass came from money, or at least from people who talked about money constantly, which is not the same thing. Her father, from what I gathered, had made a significant amount in commercial development and then lost most of it in 2008. Though the family seemed unwilling to acknowledge this had happened, they still spoke about wealth the way people do when they're performing it, rather than living it. Derek fell into that performance completely. Within 2 years of marrying Cass, he had leased a $90,000 BMW he couldn't afford, moved into a $5,200 a month apartment in River North, and began describing himself at dinner parties as a real estate developer, a title that had quietly replaced sales associate somewhere along the way. Carol noticed before I did. She said to me once, a few months before her diagnosis, "I think Derek is confused about who he is." I told her he was just finding his footing. She gave me the look she reserved for when she thought I was being willfully obtuse and let it drop. She was right, of course. She usually was. Carol died in March. By the following January, Derek and Cass had started visiting more regularly. At first I was grateful. Grief does strange things to your perception of time, and the house felt very large in those early months. Having them around helped, but I was a forensic accountant. Pattern recognition isn't just a professional skill, it's how I see the world. And patterns were emerging that I couldn't ignore. The visits always included questions, casual conversational questions, the kind you don't notice unless you're trained to notice things. "Dad, do you have a financial advisor you trust? Dad, Have you updated your beneficiaries since Mum passed? Dad, this house must be expensive to maintain on your own. Have you ever thought about a condo? Derek would wander through the house while Cass kept me occupied in conversation, and I could hear him opening and closing things in my office. I said nothing. I waited. The second pattern was the documentation. Twice in 4 months, Cass produced papers she needed me to sign, once for what she described as a medical proxy update, once for a bank authorization form related to a joint account she said would make it easier to help me with bills. Both times, I scanned the documents briefly and signed. I trusted my daughter-in-law, my son's wife, Carol's daughter-in-law. That was my error, and I've made peace with it. Because even forensic accountants are not immune to the particular blindness that comes from loving someone. The third pattern was the story they were building. Over several months, Cass had mentioned to neighbors, to Carol's friends, to my brother Raymond's wife, that I had been struggling since Carol passed. Not in a dramatic way, subtly. He seems a little lost. He forgets things. I worry about him in that big house alone. Small seeds, carefully planted in the right soil. I know this because my neighbor Phyllis, a retired schoolteacher who has lived 3 doors down for 22 years, told me all of it after the guardianship petition arrived. Phyllis is 74 and has no patience for nonsense, which is why Carol liked her enormously. She called me the morning after the process server visit and said, "Lawrence, I need to tell you some things that woman has been saying about you, and I think you should hear them." I drove to Phyllis's house and listened for 40 minutes. By the time I drove home, I understood exactly what had been happening and approximately how long it had been in motion. Here is what Cass and Derek had actually been doing for the past 18 months. Derek's commercial real estate business had collapsed. Not the normal kind of business difficulty. A real collapse. The kind that comes from overextension, from borrowing against future commissions that never materialized, from guaranteeing loans on development projects that stalled when interest rates climbed. He owed money to 3 private lenders, 2 of them through informal arrangements that carried consequences I can only describe as non-legal. Cass's credit cards were maxed to a combined limit of $84,000. Their River North apartment lease was 60 days from default. The total picture, as I would later understand it with Veronica's help, I'll get to Veronica, was approximately $620,000 in debt, not counting the BMW, which was 3 payments behind. My estate, conservatively valued, was around $1.4 million. The house alone was worth $890,000 in the current Naperville market. My retirement accounts held another $490,000. I had no outstanding debt. A financial guardianship, once granted, would give Derek full legal control over all of it. He could sell the house. He could liquidate the retirement accounts, subject to tax penalties he would absorb as a cost of doing business. He could pay off his debts and disappear to whatever version of life he and Cass had constructed in their imagination. I would be placed, presumably, somewhere manageable. The petition included a recommendation for an assisted living evaluation. There were facilities in downstate Illinois, the petition noted helpfully, with excellent amenity packages at affordable rates. I sat in my kitchen for a long time reading that line, excellent amenity packages at affordable rates. Carol would have had something to say about that. I couldn't hear her voice clearly enough anymore to know exactly what, but I knew it would have been precise and final. I picked up my phone and called my former supervisor at the FBI Chicago field office. Frank Delaney had retired 2 years after I did, and now ran private investigations out of a small office in Oak Park. When I explained the situation, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Lawrence, you're going to want a very specific kind of attorney. Do you want me to make some calls?" I told him yes. And while he was making those calls, I said, "I'd like you to look into Derek's financial situation." "Everything," he said. I assumed as much. "Give me 3 days. The attorney Frank recommended was a woman named Barbara Cho. She ran a small firm in Downers Grove that specialized in financial elder law and estate litigation. The kind of practice that exists specifically because what Derek and Cass were attempting was not uncommon. Barbara was 55, spoke quickly, and had the organized aggression of someone who had spent years watching families eat each other alive and had decided to do something about it. We met 2 days after the petition arrived. She reviewed everything I had, including the 2 documents I had signed, and sat back in her chair with the expression of someone confirming a diagnosis they had already suspected. "The medical proxy is probably legitimate," she said. "The bank authorization is more interesting. Do you know what account it was for?" I told her it was supposedly for a convenience account to help with bill payments. She nodded. "Let me guess. You've never seen a statement from that account?" I told her I hadn't. She nodded again. "We'll need to look at that closely. If they've been moving money out of it, we have immediate grounds for criminal referral in addition to contesting the guardianship." The guardianship petition itself, she explained, was built on a narrative that required evidence. The court would appoint an independent evaluator to assess my mental and financial competence. If I could demonstrate clearly, documentably, that I was fully capable of managing my affairs, the petition would fail on its foundation. Barbara's job was to make sure the foundation didn't just crack. She wanted it demolished. What they didn't know was that I had spent 3 decades building a very particular set of skills, and those skills were about to be relevant in a personal capacity for the first time. I had kept copies of everything, not because I suspected Derek specifically, but because I am constitutionally incapable of discarding documentation. My home office contains organized files going back to 1991. Every document Cass had ever asked me to sign, I had photographed with my phone before signing, a habit I developed sometime in my mid-50s without ever consciously deciding to. My phone backed up automatically to a cloud account Derek and Cass did not know existed. Frank called on day 4. He had been thorough. Derek's LLC, Holtz Meridian Properties, had filed for dissolution with the Illinois Secretary of State 6 months earlier. His real estate license had lapsed for non-payment of renewal fees. The BMW was being tracked by the financing company's GPS for potential repossession. 3 of the private lenders had retained attorneys. There was something else. One of the lenders, Frank said, is a man named Alan Bosworth. He has a history in Illinois civil courts. I'm going to text you the case numbers. He's been a plaintiff in 4 civil suits in the past 8 years, all involving loan collection from individuals. 2 of the defendants were elderly. In one of those cases, Bosworth worked with the borrower's family member to expedite repayment through an estate transaction. I understood what Frank was saying. This wasn't just Derek and Cass improvising. Alan Bosworth had pointed them toward a solution. A financial guardianship over a wealthy parent was, in certain circles, a known mechanism for quickly liquidating assets to satisfy debts. There are consultants for this, apparently. People who explain to desperate borrowers how to legally or near-legally extract money from family estates. I had seen references to the practice in financial crime literature. I had not expected to become a case study. The day I discovered the bank account was a Tuesday in November. Cold, the way only northern Illinois in November can be cold. The kind of cold that makes the sky look white even when there are no clouds. Barbara had subpoenaed the account records. I was in her office when she opened the file. The account had been opened in my name, with Cass listed as co-owner 11 months earlier. In that time, $34,000 had flowed through it from transfers that I had not authorized, drawn from a brokerage account I had not actively monitored since Carol handled most of our household finances. I looked at the statement for a long time. Derek had grown up in the house on Maple Ridge Drive. I had driven him to his first day of kindergarten in a 1992 Ford station wagon, while Carol cried quietly in the passenger seat. I taught him to ride a bike in this cold, in a November not unlike this one, running alongside him until my knees gave out, and he rode 30 feet on his own and looked back at me with an expression I have never entirely forgotten. That was a long time ago. I asked Barbara what the $34,000 had been spent on. She slid a second page across the desk. Restaurant charges, retail purchases in the Magnificent Mile shopping district, 2 wire transfers to an account registered in Cass's maiden name. I said, "All right. What do we do next?" The guardianship hearing was set for 8 weeks out. Barbara filed a formal objection within 48 hours of my first meeting with her, and simultaneously requested an emergency protective order to freeze all accounts accessible by Derek or Cass that contained my assets. The motion was granted within 2 days by a DuPage County judge who had seen this pattern before and was not inclined to let it progress. Derek called me the evening the freeze order was served. He didn't yell. That surprised me. He sounded, instead, like someone who had prepared for this call, who had rehearsed it. "Dad, I know you're upset. We were trying to help. Cass and I have been worried about you for a long time. You seemed different since Mum died. I just want to make sure you're protected." I waited until he finished. "Derek," I said, "I know about Holt Meridian. I know it dissolved 6 months ago. I know about Alan Bosworth and what you owe him. I know about the bank account and where the $34,000 went. I know about the 2 lenders with attorneys and the BMW and the River North lease default." Silence. "I'm not angry," I said. "I want you to know that. But I want you to understand exactly what I know before this goes any further, so that whatever decision you make next, you make it with complete information." He hung up. I set the phone on the kitchen table and sat there for a while, listening to the refrigerator hum. My former colleague at the FBI, a woman named Veronica, who now ran a private financial investigations practice in Schaumburg, had been working quietly on the documentary side since Frank made the referral. She had a gift for reconstructing financial histories from fragments, the professional equivalent of finding a complete sentence in a box of torn paper. By the time the guardianship hearing arrived, she had built a timeline covering every financial decision Derek and Cass had made in the past 2 years, cross-referenced with every interaction they'd had with my accounts. It was, Barbara said when she reviewed it, about as airtight as she'd ever seen in a civil filing. The hearing itself was a Thursday in January. Barbara and I arrived early. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. DuPage County Probate Court doesn't have the gravity of federal proceedings, but the stillness in the room when Derek and Cass entered with their attorney, a man who specialized in elder law from the family's side, felt significant. I looked at my son. He looked older than I remembered. The expensive suit he was wearing had a small coffee stain on the lapel he hadn't noticed. Their attorney, a man named Graham Fuller, opened with the narrative Cass had spent months constructing. He was gentle, almost sorrowful about it. An aging father, isolated by grief, managing complex finances without support, showing troubling signs of confusion. He produced 2 affidavits from neighbors I barely knew who had spoken to Cass at a block party the previous summer, and relayed concerns she had expressed to them. I noticed one of the affiants was a couple, the Hendersons, who had moved to our street only 14 months ago. I'd met them once, briefly, when they were moving boxes. Cass had apparently made a stronger impression on them than I had. Barbara let Fuller finish without interruption. Then she stood up. "Your Honor," she said, "my client has been a forensic accountant with the FBI for 31 years, including serving as a senior analyst in the Financial Crimes Unit and testifying as an expert witness in over 60 federal cases." She paused for exactly the right amount of time. "If there exists a less plausible candidate for financial incompetence in DuPage County, I am not aware of who it would be." She submitted my FBI personnel file, redacted appropriately. She submitted my most recent financial statements, every account, organized and annotated in a manner she said she'd never seen from a layperson before. She submitted documentation of the fraudulent bank account, the $34,000 in unauthorized transfers, and Veronica's complete financial reconstruction of Derek and Cass's situation. Then she played the recording. This is what neither Derek nor Cass knew. 8 weeks before the petition was filed, Cass had visited me on a Sunday afternoon. It was a peasant visit on the surface. She brought coffee cake from a bakery in Hinsdale, asked about my health, talked about the house. Near the end of the visit, she made a comment I noted at the time and recorded because I had, by that point, a specific and documented reason to be cautious. She said, "Dad, I just want you to know that Derek and I are going to take care of everything. Whatever needs to happen with the house, with the accounts, you don't have to worry. We'll handle it." That sentence, in context, with what Barbara had established about their financial situation and their plans for my assets, was what the judge described in her ruling as a statement consistent with premeditated intent to gain control of a protected party's estate. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Derek and Cass's attorney attempted 3 different redirections, all of which Barbara had anticipated. At one point, Fuller suggested that my professional background actually made me more likely to make complex financial errors because people with expertise often become overconfident. It was a creative argument. The judge looked at him for a moment and then asked Barbara to continue. The petition was denied, in full, with a notation in the ruling that the petitioners had demonstrated, quote, a pattern of behavior consistent with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, warranting referral to the Illinois Attorney General's Elder Abuse Unit. Derek and Cass were not handcuffed in the courtroom. Civil proceedings don't work that way, and honestly, I would not have wanted that. But they walked out of that courtroom and directly into a conversation with 2 investigators from the AG's office who had been waiting in the hallway. I know because Barbara told me afterward. I did not watch. I sat in my seat and let the room empty around me. The criminal investigation that followed took 7 months. I won't reconstruct all of it because some of it involved proceedings I wasn't party to, and because the details belong to the justice system rather than to me. What I can tell you is that Alan Bosworth, the private lender who had counseled Derek on using a guardianship to liquidate my estate, was indicted on 3 counts of conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. He had done this before, as Frank's early research had suggested, and the pattern across multiple victims was sufficient for the prosecutor to build a case that didn't require my cooperation specifically. Derek pleaded guilty to financial exploitation of an elderly person, a Class 3 felony in Illinois. He received 3 years of probation, mandatory financial counseling, and restitution of the $34,000 plus interest. The BMW was repossessed. The River North apartment lease was broken at considerable penalty. As far as I know, he and Cass are now living in her parents' house in Elmhurst. Cass was charged separately. She is still, at the time I'm telling you this, working through the legal process with an attorney, which means I can't say much more about it. Her attorney, notably, is not Graham Fuller, who withdrew from the matter shortly after the hearing. 3 weeks after the hearing, my brother Raymond called. He lives in Phoenix now. Retired from the Postal Service, calls on the first Sunday of every month like clockwork. I told him what had happened, as plainly as I could. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Lawrence, I always worried about that girl." I told him Cass wasn't entirely the problem. He said, "I know. That's the harder part." I told him it was. Some conversations don't have resolutions. You just have them, and then you go on. Phyllis brought dinner over the following week, pot roast and a peach cobbler that Carol's recipe did not appear to have been consulted for. We sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours while she told me about her own family complications. She has a daughter who has been estranged for 9 years over a dispute I never quite followed, and I found myself thinking that loneliness is not about being alone. It's about whether the people around you actually see you. Carol saw me. Phyllis sees me, in the plain, uncomplicated way of a neighbor who has nothing to gain from the seeing. Derek and Cass saw my balance sheet. I went back to working in my basement that week. I had a woodworking setup down there, nothing elaborate, a table saw, a lathe, a workbench. Carol's father built in 1962 and gave to me when we bought the house because he said a man should have something to do with his hands. I've been restoring an arts and crafts side table I found at an estate sale in Geneva. The finish had been painted over twice, badly, obscuring what turned out to be beautiful quarter-sawn oak underneath. Restoration work is patient work. You can't rush it. You have to let each layer reveal itself before you know what to do next. I got a letter from Derek in February, handwritten, 4 pages. He talked about the debt, about Cass, about feeling like he had failed at every version of himself he had tried to become. He apologized in general terms more than once. He didn't mention Carol. I noticed that. I put the letter in the filing cabinet in my office, in a folder I labeled with the case number Barbara had assigned to the matter. I don't know yet what I'll do with it. That's an honest answer. I've prosecuted enough financial crimes to know that remorse and rehabilitation are not the same thing, and I've lived enough of a life to know that the distance between a parent and a child is not always closable by will alone on either side. But I haven't thrown the letter away either. What I kept thinking about, in those weeks after the hearing, was something one of my supervisors said to me early in my career. back in 1986, when I was still new enough to be shaken by the cases. He said, "Lawrence, the worst financial crimes are always the same crime underneath. They're always someone deciding that another person's life is a resource. Once you see it that way," he said, "you can't unsee it." He was right. I've been unable to unsee it for 40 years. What Derek and Cass had decided, in the quiet arithmetic of their desperation, was that my life, my house, my savings, my 3-decade career, Carol's careful years of managing our money so we'd have enough, was a resource available for their use. They had dressed it up in language about help and protection and family, but underneath it was the same calculation I had documented hundreds of times in federal court. They just hadn't counted on the calculator fighting back. I finished the side table in March. The quarter-sawn oak came out beautifully, the original grain visible once I stripped back everything that had been painted over it. I put it in the living room next to Carol's chair, the one I haven't been able to move, and it looks like it was always supposed to be there. Phyllis came over to see it and said, "Lawrence, that's a beautiful piece." I told her it just needed someone to be patient with it. She looked at me with Carol's kind of directness and said, "I think you're talking about more than the table." I told her maybe I was. She went home and left me with the quiet house and the oak table and the late afternoon light coming through the windows, and I sat in my chair and looked at Carol's chair and thought about what restoration actually means. Not returning something to what it was. You can never do that exactly, but finding the original quality underneath all the damage and bringing it forward into the present where it can still be useful. That seemed, on the whole, like enough. I'd spent a long time thinking about what Derek and Cass actually believed when they set this in motion. I don't think they saw themselves as villains. That's the part that took me the longest to sit with. I think they saw a problem. Their debt, their collapsed ambitions, the gap between the life they'd constructed and the life they could actually afford. And they saw a solution sitting right there in a 4-bedroom colonial in Naperville. They told themselves a story about helping. People almost always do. But here's what I've come to understand, and I mean this in the plainest possible terms, with no comfort attached to it. The choices we make about other people reveal exactly who we are, not who we intend to be, not who we tell ourselves we are at our best moments, but who we actually are when the stakes are real and the costs are ours to bear. Derek made a choice. Cass made a choice. They made it carefully, deliberately, over 18 months, with a plan and a consultant and a legal mechanism. That's not desperation. That's character, and character, in my experience, has consequences. Not because the universe is watching and keeping score. I don't believe that and I won't pretend to. But because decisions leave evidence. Every financial crime I ever investigated came apart the same way. Someone believed they were smarter than the paper trail. They were wrong. Derek believed he was smarter than a retired FBI forensic accountant. He was wrong in a way that will follow him for years. What I want to say to anyone watching this who finds themselves in a situation that feels impossible, whether it's debt or failure or the slow collapse of something you built, is that desperation is not a moral excuse. It explains things. It doesn't justify them. The moment you decide that someone else's life is a resource for your survival, you have crossed a line that doesn't uncross easily, and the person on the other side of that line will remember. I also want to say something about intelligence, because I think it gets misunderstood. People assumed, because I was 67 and alone and grieving, that I was diminished. Cass built an entire legal strategy on that assumption. What she didn't understand is that grief doesn't erase who you are. It strips away everything unnecessary and leaves the core of you more visible, not less. I spent 31 years learning how fraud works. That knowledge didn't retire when I did. Pay attention to the details. I told my son that when he was 9 years old and struggling with a math problem, I said it to myself on the morning the petition arrived, standing on my own porch in the cold. It turns out the same advice applies to the largest problems and the smallest ones equally. The oak table is in my living room now. I look at it most mornings with coffee. It took patience and the right tools and the willingness to strip back everything that had been painted over it to find what was actually there. I think that's true of a lot of things. The quality was always underneath. You just have to be willing to do the work to bring it forward. That's enough. That's really all I know.